In the bitter winter of 1368, amidst the rolling fields of northern France, a child was born into a kingdom fractured by war and disease. Charles, heir to the French throne, came into a world already trembling under the weight of the 100 Years' War. Europe's longest conflict had begun decades earlier, and the French crown was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the English kings, who held territories on both sides of the Channel and claimed rights to the throne of France. This fragile infant, destined to rule, would inherit not only a crown but a world teetering on the edge of chaos. The roots of this war stretched back to 1066, when French dukes had helped shape the Norman conquest of England. French-speaking kings sat upon the English throne, marrying French nobles, rewarding French lords with English estates, yet still maintaining vast territories in France itself. This dual allegiance created tension that simmered for generations. By 1337, only Gascony remained under English control in France, and when the French crown moved to reclaim it, Edward III of England launched an invasion, claiming the French crown as his own. The early victories of the English were dramatic. The battles of Crécy and Poitiers sent shockwaves through the French nobility, but fate intervened. A freak hailstorm decimated Edward's army, forcing him to renounce his claim, leaving France battered but not broken. Charles II's father, Charles V, revitalized the French army, reclaiming much of the lost land. Yet his early death in 1380 would thrust an 11-year-old Charles onto the throne, a boy with the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. Charles was placed under the guardianship of his uncles, who pursued their own ambitions while the young king indulged in the pleasures of youth, hunting, jousting, and reveling in courtly excess. Chroniclers described him as lusty and passionate, prone to pleasures both innocent and licentious. By 16 he was married to the 14-year-old Isabel of Bavaria, a union that would produce 12 children, binding alliances but also sowing seeds of domestic strain. At 20, Charles assumed nominal control of the kingdom. Advisors who had guided his father continued to manage affairs of state, while Charles continued to pursue his sports and pleasures, a young man on the edge of a kingdom desperate for stability. Yet beneath this veneer of vigor, a shadow loomed, one that would define his reign. In 1392, while attending peace negotiations at the Grand Palais in Amiens, Charles fell violently ill. High fevers gripped him, and delirium claimed his mind. His hair and nails fell out, a symptom that puzzled even the most learned physicians. Modern historians have debated the cause. Some suggest a rare inflammatory disorder called sarcoidosis. Others, noting the simultaneous illness of courtiers, point to an infectious disease, likely typhoid fever. After months, he recovered enough to resume hunting, but the kingdom had already glimpsed the fragile foundation upon which their new king stood. Even as he tried to lead, Charles was vulnerable, both physically and mentally. Later that same year, Charles faced betrayal close to home. One of his most trusted advisors, the Constable of France, was attacked and left for dead. Enraged, Charles attempted to rally an army to punish the offender. Fever still burned in his body, and his mind wavered between reality and frenzy. A journey through the forest near Le Mans culminated in an episode of terrifying violence. Charles, believing his companions were enemies, drew his sword and attacked, killing several men before collapsing from exhaustion. Physicians could offer little beyond ancient humoral remedies. The elderly Guillaume de Jacini, attributed the king's madness to the lingering effects of his mother's postnatal depression, prescribing rest, sleep, and nourishment. These remedies, rooted in Greek theories of balancing the body's four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, reflected a world still struggling to understand the mind. While Charles slowly recovered, power shifted. His uncles seized control once more, exploiting the king's weakness. The nation teetered on the brink, its monarchy vulnerable, its enemies waiting. Within the palace walls, fear and intrigue intertwined, as advisors jockeyed for influence, and France's enemies sharpened their swords, ready to strike. Little did the kingdom know, this was only the beginning. Charles's episodes of madness would grow stranger, darker, and more terrifying. In time, the king who had once hunted and jousted with vigor would believe his body made of glass, taking extraordinary precautions to avoid shattering. The fragile monarch, beloved by some and feared by others, was on a path that would plunge France into civil war and invite English invasion. The boy born amidst the 100 Years' War was becoming a king, haunted by his own mind. A king whose reign would be defined as much by his fragility as by his crown. And so, the stage was set for the tragic story of Charles VI, the king who would be both loved and feared, a monarch caught between brilliance and madness, history and delusion. The heat of July 1392 bore down mercilessly on northern France. Crops wilted, livestock perished, and the sun seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. Charles VI, still recovering from his mysterious febrile illness, insisted on leading his army against the Duke of Brittany, whom he blamed for the attack on his trusted constable. The journey was agonizingly slow, the summer oppressive, and the king's mind, already fragile, began to unravel under the heat and stress. As the royal procession entered a dense forest near Le Mans, a ragged man appeared, rushing toward the king's horse. "Ride no further, noble king. You are betrayed," he cried. The escort drove the man away, yet he followed for half an hour, repeating his warnings. Charles's mind, poised on the edge of sanity, teetered. By the time the company emerged into an open plain, a dropped lance startled the king. Believing his companions to be enemies, he drew his sword and attacked, killing several men before collapsing, exhausted, onto the ground. For 2 days, he lay barely conscious, speaking gibberish. The king's physician, the 92-year-old Guillaume de Jassini, offered a diagnosis grounded in the ancient humoral theory. Charles's madness was the result of an imbalance inherited from his mother, who had suffered postnatal depression. The remedy was simple: rest, sleep, nourishment, yet wholly inadequate to quell the storm raging within the king's mind. While Charles lay incapacitated, his uncles moved quickly to seize control, exploiting the power vacuum. The kingdom, ever precarious, trembled on the brink of disorder. In 1393, the fragile peace of the court was shattered at a masquerade known as the Ball of the Burning Men. Lords and nobles, including the king, danced in wild, shaggy costumes meant to evoke savagery and strength. The revelry turned into horror when a torch ignited one of the costumes. Flames spread rapidly. 4 men died in the chaos, and others were severely burned. The king's life was narrowly spared when a duchess threw the train of her gown over him, shielding him from the fire. Yet the spectacle haunted the court, a vivid symbol of a monarchy perched on the edge of disaster. By 1394, Charles's mental state deteriorated further. He began to disavow his identity, claiming he was not king, not named Charles, and had never married. He defaced his own coat of arms and that of his wife, Isabel. Yet despite these delusions, he recognized his household officers, showing that his madness was selective, a profound and disturbing blend of lucidity and psychosis. Contemporary accounts describe him alternating between violent frenzy and profound despair. In one moment, he would run through the halls of the Hôtel Saint-Paul, shrieking that he was escaping unseen enemies. In another, he would lie prostrate for months, refusing to bathe or change his linen, inviting lice and disease. His episodes were punctuated by brief periods of clarity, during which he attended to matters of state, demonstrating a terrifying oscillation between reason and madness. Desperate, his physicians resorted to measures both archaic and invasive. Trepanning, the drilling of holes into the skull, was performed, a procedure with roots in prehistoric Europe, but almost unheard of in 14th century France. The aim was to release evil spirits or rebalance humors, yet whether this intervention truly aided his recovery remains unknown. After 6 months, Charles emerged from this episode, offering thanks for his survival at the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, his mind momentarily at peace. Charles's recurrent illness created a kingdom in turmoil. His uncles, his wife Isabel, and his brother Louis vied for influence, fracturing the royal household. Meanwhile, England observed with keen interest. Henry V, a calculating and ruthless king, would later exploit these divisions to invade and seize French territory. France was not only physically vulnerable, it was psychologically fractured, a reflection of the instability at its very center, the monarch. By the early 1400s, Charles's madness entered an even stranger phase. Reports describe the king declaring that he was made of glass, so fragile that a single touch might shatter him. To protect himself, he had iron rods sewn into his clothing and forbade anyone from touching him. The glass delusion was rare in Europe, but Charles was not alone. Others, similarly afflicted, believed their bones, hearts, or even heads were made of glass. Some refused to sit, fearing they would break. Others hid from the world, convinced that a malevolent craftsman would melt them down for windows. This delusion, grotesque and tragic, exemplified the terrifying intimacy of his illness. It was not merely physical or behavioral, but penetrated the very core of his identity. The king who once hunted and jousted with vigor now navigated the world as if every moment might end in catastrophe, a fragile vessel in a kingdom built on swords and blood. The consequences of Charles's mental fragility extended beyond his personal suffering. His incapacity sparked a struggle for power that would plunge France into civil war, weaken royal authority, and invite foreign conquest. Henry V of England would seize upon this vulnerability, leading to the devastating defeat at Agincourt in 1415, where French nobility were slaughtered and the nation humiliated. Yet the story of Charles VI is more than a tale of military disaster. It is a story of the human mind under extraordinary pressure, of a king trapped between reason and delusion, and of a kingdom unable to escape the shadow of his illness. By the mid-1390s, France's court had become a labyrinth of intrigue, ambition, and fear. Charles VI, once a vibrant young king, now wandered the corridors of his palaces like a ghost, alternately violent and listless, oscillating between bouts of paranoia and despair. His nobles watched nervously, unsure whether their king would recognize them or strike them down in a sudden frenzy. The uncles who had once acted as regents began to carve out personal fiefdoms within the court, while Charles's brother Louis and his wife Isabel maneuvered carefully to protect their own interests. The king's delusions intensified. He declared repeatedly that he was not Charles, that he was not king, and that his children were strangers to him. He defaced the royal coat of arms, desecrating the symbols of his authority in acts of compulsion that left courtiers horrified. Yet in moments of clarity, he still attempted to govern, issuing decrees and attending ceremonies, a terrifying reminder that his mind could still summon the king it once had been. Isabel of Bavaria, the queen, became a focus of the king's suspicion and resentment. Rumors whispered through the court that she had taken lovers, perhaps even involving Charles's own brother, Louis of Orleans. To maintain appearances, Isabel allowed a young companion, known as the Little Queen, to take her place in public ceremonies. These arrangements, however, could not stem the growing tide of paranoia and violence. The palace, once a center of culture and power, had become a stage for the king's inner torment and the nobles' ambitions. By the first decade of the 1400s, Charles's mind had entered a profoundly unusual state. He became convinced that his body was made of glass, so fragile that even a brush against a servant might shatter him. To protect himself, iron rods were sewn into his clothing. He forbade anyone from touching him, and his movements were calculated to avoid perceived harm. This rare and terrifying delusion was emblematic of the fragility of his reign, a monarchy built on ceremony, pageantry, and physical presence, now governed by fear of intangible threats. In some episodes, he was feverish, wildly excitable, breaking objects, throwing precious items into flames, or even urinating on gowns and tapestries. In others, he lay prostrate for weeks, refusing to bathe, eat properly, or change his clothing, inviting lice, sores, and disease. Each relapse widened the power vacuum in France and weakened the crown in the eyes of both domestic and foreign powers. Charles's instability allowed factions within his family to seize control. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions emerged, led by his brother Louis of Orleans and his cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Rivalries that had simmered for decades now erupted openly, plunging France into civil war. The nation, already weakened by the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, faced internal bloodshed that threatened to undo generations of political consolidation. This internal chaos could not have come at a worse time. Across the Channel, Henry V of England watched France with calculating eyes. The English king, seeing a kingdom fractured by madness and civil strife, prepared to exploit every weakness. It would not be long before the armies of England would land on French soil, seeking not just territorial gain, but the ultimate humiliation, the capture of the French crown itself. The defining moment came in 1415. Henry V invaded northern France, leading a devastating campaign that culminated in the Battle of Agincourt. The French army, composed largely of noble cavalry, was poorly coordinated, burdened by internal rivalries, and demoralized by the weakness of the king. Charles VI himself did not march with the army, his mind too fragile, his presence too unpredictable. The battle was catastrophic. Thousands of French knights were slaughtered, including many from the king's inner circle. Henry V emerged victorious, and France was left humiliated and vulnerable. Charles's incapacity to control his nobles or coordinate the kingdom's defenses had turned the crown into a shadow of its former glory. His kingdom, once a strong and centralized power, now teetered on the edge of conquest. In the aftermath, Charles VI was forced to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a humiliating accord that disinherited his own son and recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne. France's sovereignty, once a proud symbol of medieval might, was temporarily ceded to England. The king, a man once known as the Beloved, had become a figurehead, a fragile shell of authority whose illness had reshaped the fate of a nation. Yet the story did not end with defeat. The dynastic struggle set the stage for a future resurgence. Charles's son, though disinherited, would rise again with the aid of unexpected heroes, most famously Joan of Arc, and would reclaim the throne of France, proving that even amidst madness and betrayal, the tide of history could turn. By the second decade of the 15th century, Charles VI's mental illness had evolved into something both tragic and grotesque. No longer merely violent or melancholic, he believed his very body was made of glass. This glass delusion, rare and unsettling, compelled him to adopt extraordinary precautions. Iron rods were sewn into his clothing. Heavy armor of his own design shielded him, and he forbade anyone from touching him. Every gesture, every movement, was measured against the fear that a single misstep could shatter him. Contemporaries wrote of his fragility with awe and pity. Pope Pius X, centuries later, recounted that Charles would tremble if he brushed against another human being, terrified that a glazier might someday melt him down to make a window pane. The king's obsession with his own fragility became a mirror of the kingdom itself. France, battered by war and internal conflict, was teetering on the brink of collapse. Even as his delusions deepened, Charles alternated between mania and prostration. In fevered bouts, he would destroy objects, throw valuables into flames, and urinate on tapestries and gowns. In periods of depression, he lay for months without washing or changing clothes, inviting lice, sores, and infection. These extremes mirrored modern definitions of bipolar affective disorder, episodes of overactive, disinhibited mania, followed by profound depressive withdrawal. The court, meanwhile, became a dangerous stage. Factions of uncles, brothers, and nobles fought for influence, exploiting Charles's incapacity to advance their own agendas. The Queen, Isabel, became a pawn in this struggle, forced to navigate the treacherous politics of a court dominated by fear, suspicion, and a king who alternately loved, raged, and recoiled from her. Desperate to restore him, Charles's physicians tried extreme interventions. In 1405, an early form of shock therapy was enacted. 10 men, their faces blackened, were introduced into his chambers to frighten him out of months of self-neglect. Remarkably, this worked temporarily, coaxing him to resume washing and attending to his health. Other remedies included prayer, enforced exercise, diaphoretic medicines to induce sweating, and powdered pearls, reflecting a worldview in which illness was often spiritual, mystical, or humoral rather than neurological. The king's obsession with control extended to his household. By 1417, his relations with Queen Isabel had deteriorated completely. He ordered her to disband her court at the Hôtel Barbette, a palace infamous for gaiety and extravagance. The queen had once allowed a young companion to serve as a little queen in her place. But now even this arrangement was insufficient to placate the king. His paranoia and delusions left the royal family divided and vulnerable, further weakening the monarchy. Meanwhile, England, ever vigilant, seized upon France's instability. Henry V's armies invaded, culminating in the catastrophic Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Thousands of French knights died, leaving the nobility and royal family in disarray. Charles's incapacity forced him to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, disinheriting his own son and naming Henry V as heir to the French throne. France, a proud kingdom for centuries, had been reduced to a political pawn under the shadow of a king whose mind betrayed him. Despite the darkness of his delusions, Charles retained occasional lucidity. During brief intervals of reason, he attempted to govern, attending councils, issuing decrees, and even showing insight into his condition, removing his dagger and those of his courtiers when he sensed another episode approaching. These glimpses of clarity reminded all around him of the king he had once been. But the periods grew progressively shorter, and the episodes of madness grew more intense. Charles VI's reign, increasingly defined by delusion and frailty, left France vulnerable to civil war, foreign invasion, and internal betrayal. The nation's fate seemed inseparable from that of its king, whose mind had become a battlefield as treacherous as any fought on the fields of Crécy or Agincourt. France teetered between despair and hope, a reflection of the delicate, fragile monarch at its center. In the summer of 1422, Charles fell gravely ill with quartan fever, likely malaria, one of the many illnesses that preyed upon weakened bodies in medieval Europe. His body, long subjected to extremes of stress, fever, and neglect, could not withstand the final assault. He died quietly a few months later, leaving a kingdom fractured and occupied, a crown contested, and a legacy that would haunt France for decades. The death of Charles VI in 1422 left France in chaos. The disinherited Dauphin, Charles, heir to the French throne, faced a nation occupied by English forces, fractured by civil war, and burdened by decades of mismanagement and infighting. Across the Channel, Henry III's son, the infant Henry VI, was proclaimed king of both England and France under the Treaty of Troyes, cementing the humiliation of the French crown. The fragile foundations laid by Charles VI's mental illness now threatened the very survival of the monarchy. The internal divisions of France mirrored the fragility of its former king. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions continued their deadly rivalry, fighting over the control of the royal court and influencing towns, cities, and armies across the kingdom. France teetered on the edge of dissolution. Yet in these dark days, seeds of hope quietly began to take root, a hope that would rise in the form of courage, conviction, and vision. Charles, the disinherited heir, inherited more than a crown. He inherited the psychological and political aftermath of his father's reign. His grandfather's mental illness had left the monarchy weakened, and the political landscape was treacherous. Nobles who had once served Charles VI now pursued their own ambitions, while English garrisons controlled key cities in Normandy and northern France. The young Charles faced an impossible choice: submit to the Treaty of Troyes and accept humiliation, or rise against impossible odds. Guided by advisors who recognized the dangers of inaction, he began to consolidate loyal supporters, rally towns, and recruit armies, preparing to reclaim what was rightfully his. The turning point came in the form of an extraordinary figure. Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl claiming divine guidance, emerged as the symbol of French resistance. Her vision inspired troops, transformed morale, and revitalized the waning legitimacy of the French monarchy. With Joan's leadership, the Dauphin Charles was crowned at Reims in 1429, asserting his authority over a France that had once doubted him. The victories that followed were both symbolic and strategic. Joan's campaigns forced English and Burgundian forces to retreat, restored key cities, and provided the psychological momentum that the French needed to reclaim their kingdom. Charles VII, later known as Charles the Victorious, solidified his reign not just through war, but through the reclamation of national identity and pride. The successes of Charles VII marked a reversal of the tragedies that had defined his father's reign. The reign of Charles VI had been marred by mental illness, civil war, and foreign occupation, yet the dynasty endured. The monarchy, though shaken, regained legitimacy and control, and France began to recover from the political and psychological scars left by the Glass King. Charles VI's illness, once seen as a personal failure, became a historical lesson in the fragility of leadership and the vulnerability of nations to the weaknesses of those who govern. His delusions, episodes of violence and incapacitation, highlighted the human cost of mental illness, particularly in an era devoid of medical understanding or compassion. Yet in the aftermath, his son's resilience and the courage of figures like Joan of Arc demonstrated that even the deepest wounds of history could give rise to triumph. Charles II's story is one of contrasts: power and fragility, brilliance and madness, love and cruelty. Known as both Charles the Beloved and Charles the Mad, he embodied the paradoxes of medieval kingship. His reign reminds us that monarchs, like all humans, are vulnerable to forces beyond their control: disease, mind, and circumstance. Yet it is also a story of continuity. The trauma of his reign, the humiliation of Agincourt, the disinheritance under the Treaty of Troy, all of these crises set the stage for a resurgence that would shape the destiny of France. Charles VII's victories, culminating in the final expulsion of English forces in 1453, closed the chapter on the 100 Years' War, but the shadow of the Glass King lingered, a testament to the complex interplay between personal tragedy and national history. Modern historians and medical scholars have debated Charles VI's condition for centuries. Some have suggested schizophrenia, syphilis, or rare inflammatory diseases. The most persuasive diagnosis aligns with bipolar affective disorder, cycles of manic behavior, delusions, and depressive withdrawal, exacerbated by illness and stress. His first major episode may have been triggered by typhoid fever, complicated by heat stroke, but the psychological patterns were lifelong. Despite the centuries that separate us, his suffering resonates. The king who feared to shatter, who required iron rods in his clothing to survive each day, reminds us that human frailty is timeless. The story of Charles VI teaches us empathy, caution, and the enduring power of resilience, not just of kings, but of nations and people who endure in their shadows.